The church history rabbit hole goes deep, and I mean really deep. In fact, I've spent the last, 5 years or so trying to make sense of church history and read countless books, probably a couple hundred at this point. I average over 50 books a year, not to mention the books that I read for the interviews that I do, and I try to at least skim all of the authors' books that I interview. And what I've found is that you can spend a lot of time reading a lot of books, or you can get a little more strategic and read really good books and actually not have to read as many of them. Because what often happens, and this is something I'd recommend you do, is as you read books, you can kind of chase down the footnotes and you'll see there's certain kind of centers of gravity that all of these other authors are kind of orbiting around. And if you can read the book at the center of the center of gravity, you can make sense of other books better and also just not have to read as many books that are just comments and less good explanations of the original ideas. So in this video, my goal is to give you 10 books, just 10, to read to try to get further down or maybe even to the bottom, although that's probably a little too ambitious, of the rabbit hole of church history. Now, one quick kind of proviso note at this point. I am going to assume that you have a general understanding of the contours of church history. And this is so important that if you want to kind of make sense of this, there's a couple of things that you're going to have to do. You're going to have to read the primary sources, and that's going to take time. But it's so important because if you only read kind of collections of sayings of church fathers, you get a very bad sense of proportionality. What I mean is you might read a book like Upon This Rock by Steve Ray and assume that all the church fathers talk about is the Pope. But then you actually read church fathers, you discover that this isn't the main question in their heads for the most part, right? They're talking about a lot of other things. And so you can kind of get bad senses of what's important to the fathers if you only read select quotations because, well, they're going to be selected for a certain topic. So there's no substitute for just reading the fathers. This takes time. Start with the ante-Nicene fathers and move on from there. The second thing is kind of just the general shape of church history. And you can do this through any number of kind of primers on church history. If you want like a one volume, you could read something like Dominion by Tom Holland, who's not a Christian. Justo Gonzalez has a good 2-volume work from a Protestant perspective. There's like a 4-volume work by Father John Strickland from an Orthodox perspective. I don't really care which one you read, but the idea is just get an understanding of the shape of the events of church history. But what I want to talk about in this video is the books that are going to help you take that next step, because what really divides Christians isn't the facts of church history. Although some people like to make it seem like that's the case, it's really not. At the learned level, people aren't divided because they don't know the facts of church history. They're divided because they interpret the facts differently. And to understand how people interpret these facts is really important, and it allows us to get a grip on what actually divides people and how we can look at the events of church history through different lenses and come to different conclusions. And it's at this level that you can really begin to get deep in church history, in my opinion. So that's what I'm going to recommend. In this video, it's going to be 10 books on the level of kind of theory and interpretation that are going to help you make sense of church history. They're going to come from 4 different perspectives. We're going to go through 3 Catholic, 3 Protestant, 3 Orthodox, and 1 Coptic Orthodox, just to throw it in there for good measure, or really Oriental Orthodox rather. Okay, on the Catholic side, the first book I want to recommend is one of the books that actually I think it is the book that I've reread the most in this area of thought, and that is The Meaning of Tradition by Yves Congar. He was an excellent theologian around the time of Vatican II, and in this book, it's a shortened version of his longer book, Tradition and Traditions, and this gets into the question of what is tradition. It's a concept that I think a lot of us misunderstand, and Congar puts forward a Catholic theory of tradition kind of at the stage of Vatican II, in which tradition is a living thing, and he talks about the subject of tradition, the content of tradition, the act of tradition. It's tradition in many modes that will help you get a deeper understanding of what it is we're talking about when we talk about being traditional, which is what a lot of us are trying to do when we investigate church history. I can't recommend this Freudian slip there. I can't recommend this book enough, and I'm going to have a full video on it coming out soon. The second is Newman's Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. I have a video on this that is similar to what the video on Congar will be. And this essay is probably like, if you could only read one thing on this list, it's got to be Newman, because his theory on how we interpret the development of doctrine has dominated thinking ever since he wrote it in the 19th century. And his basic idea is that doctrine is kind of like a seed that flowers into a tree. And so his question that he's approaching is, hey, we go through church history and we read these authors saying this, such and such idea has been believed since the time of the apostles or is apostolic, but then when we look for its attestation, we find that doesn't line up. But anytime we do find people talking about it, they say that everyone's always believed it. So what do we make of that? Well, he gives us theories on how doctrine can develop, how seed form of ideas can flower into tree forms of ideas, and we can say that a doctrine is apostolic even if it's not explicitly taught by the apostles. He does a lot of the heavy lifting there in this book. If you want to see if the book might be worthwhile for you to read, I can recommend that you check out the video I made on it, and I think you will get a lot out of the book especially, and hopefully the video as well. The last one on the Catholic side is going to come from another kind of Vatican II era theologian, and that is Hans Urs von Balthasar. It's his really small book on the fullness of the faith. And I'm trying to recommend books that aren't like super laborious to read. This one's really easy to read. It's one of those, Ignatius Press books, I think, yeah? They have the little thing at the top. If you've read them, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, this book, to me, is a really compelling picture of what it means to be Catholic. And I think he has a very charitable vision of this. He talks about what he finds beautiful in the Catholic faith, but he does so in an explicitly kind of ecumenical frame. So he's talking to people that he assumes will disagree with him, but he wants to put forth what it means to be Catholic, what Catholicity is, and how the Roman Catholic Church offers a picture of the wholeness or the fullness of faith. It's a really good read. It's short, but it helps give you some of the Catholic vision, which I think is important for interpreting matters of Catholicism. Okay, onto the Protestant side. 3 here for you. The first is Dogmatics and Outline by Karl Barth. So I could recommend, just go read Church Dogmatics, but that's like 13 volumes or something like that. You don't have the money or the time to do that, my guess. If you do, feel free. But for most of you, reading Dogmatics and Outline will be good enough. And in it, I think one of the important ideas that he brings out is this idea that theology is a science, right? So it gets better with time as we continue to reflect on it, as we use the scripture as the thing we are studying, and we form our ideas over time and hone these thoughts to get closer and closer to the intended meaning, all of this going on here. So it gives a kind of Protestant understanding of church history insofar as our theology gets better, not worse. And this is going to be a big thing that divides Catholics and Protestants, or Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox, right? So are we just trying to recover something? Are we continually kind of getting closer to it? Are we getting further from the truth? All really important things. But if you want kind of a Protestant outlook, and probably the most important Protestant thinker in the last century or two, it's got to be Barth. I mean, he's one of those theologians that everyone has to contend with at an academic level. If you're talking about certain topics that he's talked about, you're going to be writing about Barth. And so, if you want to kind of go deeper in these areas, you should read him. And that's a good place to start. Okay, the next is a book that was written in response to Newman's development on, or essay on the development of Christian doctrine, and that's George Salmon's The Infallibility of the Church. To me, this is the best Protestant response, for my money, of Newman's claims, and really kind of Catholic claims more broadly. He gets at the idea of infallibility, and he really tries to chisel away at popular Catholic apologetics on how ecclesial infallibility is going to give us certainty and kind of shore up the Christian faith. He just isn't really buying it, and I think he gives good arguments against it. So if you want to read Newman and then read a response to Newman, no matter which side you fall on, I think reading those books, The Infallibility of the Church and Newman's essay on the development of Christian doctrine, together is a tremendously stimulating exercise. I'm also going to be making a video on that book, so stay tuned for that. The last one, this is a more modern one, and I was really struggling with which one I wanted to choose for this. I ended up choosing Philip Carey's Meaning of Protestant Theology. I think he exposits the Reformers really well here and gets at what is at the heart of Protestant theology, which is this idea of union with Christ through faith. Understanding how faith works in a Protestant context is so important because it's going to be at the core of what Protestants believe, and it's going to shape how they interpret history and how they interpret the rest of theology. This is kind of the kind of gravitational pull, right? The center around which other things orbit. So I really recommend this book. Another good one on this topic is One with Christ by, oh my goodness, he was my professor. This is so embarrassing. One with Christ, Marcus Peter Johnson. There we go. Whew, hopefully he doesn't watch this. But in any case, that's another really great one. And if you want something specifically kind of like sacramental from a Protestant point of view, The Mystical Presence by John Williamson Nevin is the book to go to. Okay, that was a couple bonuses, but that was Dogmatics and Outline, The Meaning of Protestant Theology, and The Infallibility of the Church. All of these will be linked down below, and I'm sure some kind person will put timestamps down below as well. Okay, on the Orthodox side, I was going to recommend The Vindication of Tradition by Yaroslav Pelikan because it kind of fits with this idea of interpreting history. But I must be honest, I haven't read it. I've heard great things about it, but I can't tell you to read it if I haven't read it. And so what I'm going to recommend in its place is one that I have read and everyone loves, although it's a little less historical in its focus, and that is going to be For the Life of the World by Father Alexander Schmemann. This gives you kind of a shape of the Orthodox liturgy, which might seem like, what does that have to do with history? But he gets into that, and it's also so important because the liturgy is kind of that thing around which everything else orbits in Orthodox theology. So understanding what's going on with it is going to be essential to understanding Orthodoxy. The second is going to be Father John Zizioulas' book, Eucharist, Bishop, Church. This is a kind of laying out the, well, maybe not the, but an Orthodox ecclesiology. Why is this important? Well, Orthodox ecclesiology has to make sense of the relationship between kind of the local ecclesiology and the universal ecclesiology. This is really easy for Rome, right? Because you have a universal pontiff, right? And so what does it mean to be in the church? It means to be in communion with the Pope, and the Pope kind of has that jurisdiction over everybody. Easy peasy. Well, in the Orthodox Church is not quite as easy because you don't have a universal bishop in the same way, and so you have to ask, how do bishops relate to one another, and what does it mean to be in a church that is part of the church? Well, that's what Zizioulas answers in this. He puts forward an idea that the church is where the bishop is, where the Eucharist is. He ties these things all together and kind of puts forth a local ecclesiology, or a Eucharistic, to be more specific, ecclesiology over against a kind of part whole ecclesiology. Ooh, that sounds complicated. Read the book, you'll love it. Okay, the last one is another classic, and that is The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church by Vladimir Lossky. It's going to be a good kind of primer on theology, but also is going to put forth a vision of what it means to be Orthodox and how that relates to history specifically and fidelity to the fathers. There's other people that do this really well too. You could read Florovsky, Bible Church Tradition, or kind of just any collection of his writings are going to give you this sense of what it means to retrieve the fathers, the neo-patristic synthesis as it's called, but I'm going to recommend Lossky for now, The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. These three books together are going to give you a good grasp of kind of orthodoxy and how it relates to history and today. The final book is from the Oriental perspective, and that's going to be The Council of Chalcedon Reexamined by Father V.C. Samuels. This is a book that has been really fascinating to me because the central kind of rift between the Oriental Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox, as well as the Catholics, at least early on, is that of Chalcedon. Now, the common narratives you hear about Chalcedon are often not that precise as far as the evidence actually weighs out. And so here's an example where learning the facts and not just the interpretation can be helpful. And so I think it's an area that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. So the Council of Chalcedon Reexamined, I think, is a helpful book. It's not polemical, but it is going to offer a different vision of those events. Okay, so those are the 10 books I recommend for you in this coming year. I want to say Happy New Year to you all if you're watching this video as it comes out. I hope you have a great year of reading, but I hope it's more than reading. I hope that you have a great year of learning and gaining wisdom and insight and deepening your faith in Christ. And so if these books can be helpful for that, I commend them to you. And if they're not, then feel free to read other things. But one of my goals for this year is actually to read less books. I mentioned that over the past couple of years, I average about 50 books a year. I want to shrink that down and read better books. And this video is an attempt to help you read better books as well. I'd love to know, what are some of the most important books you've read that have had that effect of, ooh, reading this one book saved me reading 10 others. Those are the books I'm looking for, so comment them down below.